Metallic clink of coins drowns out a child's sobs as a father sells his 10-year-old daughter for a single sack of grain. Barefoot in the mud, young Alara watches her childhood end in a transaction no one around her questions. But in the shadowed corners of the castle where she's enslaved, this seemingly powerless girl begins to see what others miss. The hidden machinery of corruption that grinds kingdoms and crushes souls. When the queen's necklace mysteriously disappears, Alara becomes the perfect scapegoat. Thrown into the dungeons at 12, she meets a prisoner who sees something in her that everyone else missed. A mind that could bring down an empire. Between damp stone walls, she learns forbidden knowledge that will transform her from victim to the most dangerous person in the kingdom. What happens when those who rule through fear and deception face their greatest nightmare, a slave who knows their darkest secrets and has nothing left to lose? The answer will shake a kingdom to its foundations and crown an unlikely queen who will change medieval history forever. The metallic clink of coins echoed louder than the child's sobs. Standing barefoot in the mud, 10-year-old Alara watched her father's calloused hands accept payment for her life, a single sack of wheat. Her throat constricted as she tried to swallow back tears, a futile effort against the overwhelming betrayal seeping into her bones like the autumn chill. The marketplace bustled around them, indifferent to the human transaction taking place in plain sight. Fresh bread scents from nearby stalls mingled cruelly with the acrid smell of iron shackles biting into her fragile wrists, their weight a constant reminder that childhood ends when survival begins. "She's small but strong enough for kitchen work," her father muttered, not meeting her eyes. "Never been sick a day." His voice cracked slightly, the only hint that perhaps some fragment of remorse existed within him. Alara's gaze fixed on a puddle near her feet, watching her reflection fragment as a tear rippled the murky surface. She wondered which version of herself would walk away from this moment, the daughter who once believed in a father's protection, or the property being bartered away for food that would not feed her. The merchant circled her like a vulture, fingers prodding her shoulders and arms with clinical detachment. "Teeth?" he demanded. Alara's jaw clenched tight, but a sharp jab to her ribs forced her mouth open. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as rough fingers pried at her lips, counting and assessing, like one might inspect a horse. Something dark and heavy settled in her chest, not just fear, but a seed of something fiercer that would later bloom into resolution. The merchant nodded, satisfied, while nearby villagers averted their eyes, their silence a damning collusion. "Father," she whispered, one last desperate plea, but he had already turned away, clutching the grain sack to his chest. The merchant yanked her chain, and stumbling forward, she caught a glimpse of her father's shoulders, not squared with pride or certainty, but hunched with shame he would never acknowledge. In that moment something fundamental snapped inside her, a clean break between before and after. Her rag doll, her only possession, was tucked secretly against her stomach beneath her tattered dress. Its presence pressed against her skin with each labored breath, the last connection to a life evaporating before her eyes. The wooden cart awaited, its splintered planks already occupied by two hollow-eyed boys and a girl whose vacant stare spoke of lessons Alara would soon learn. The merchant shoved her forward, and her bare feet scraped against rough wood as she climbed aboard. As the cart lurched into motion, the merchant's voices grated through the air like coarse sand. "This one'll serve until she dies, or until she's worth nothing." They laughed, the sound devoid of mirth. "The Lord needs kitchen girls after the fever took half the staff." Alara's fingers dug into her hidden doll, its fabric worn smooth by years of tears and whispered secrets. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood, determined not to cry where they could see. Tears were a luxury she could no longer afford. The horizon disappeared behind them as the cart rumbled along the rutted road. With each jolt, Alara felt herself being carried further from everything familiar, however meager that had been. The autumn wind whipped strands of hair across her face, stinging her eyes already raw from unshed tears. Fields of wheat, the very crop she had been traded for, swayed mockingly in the distance. Her stomach twisted with hunger, a sensation she would need to befriend. The castle emerged against the darkening sky, its stone towers like teeth against the twilight. Alara had only glimpsed it from afar before, a fairy tale structure that village children whispered about with awe and fear. Now its walls loomed as her prison, not her refuge. Other servants scurried about the courtyard like ants, purpose in every movement. Her new life awaited in that rhythmic choreography of servitude. That first night in the castle kitchens, Alara collapsed onto cold stone floors, exhaustion overtaking fear. The cook, a woman with hands like gnarled roots and eyes that had forgotten kindness, had worked her until her fingers blistered, scrubbing pots larger than her entire body. Her muscles burned with each breath, yet sleep remained elusive as strange sounds echoed through stone corridors. Laughter from the great hall, shouts from the guards, the occasional scream whose origin she dared not imagine. Curled around her hidden doll, Alara made a silent vow in the darkness. The humiliation of this day would burn forever in her memory, fueling whatever came next. She would remember the weight of these chains, the sound of those coins, the smell of bread she couldn't eat. She would remember her father's turned back. But what she couldn't know, what no one in the castle suspected, was that with each indignity, each small cruelty, they were forging something unexpected within this child. As dawn approached, a guard passed by the kitchen doorway, pausing longer than necessary. His eyes narrowed as they fixed upon her small form. There was something in his gaze beyond the expected contempt, something calculating, watchful. He lingered, studying her as one might study a puzzle with missing pieces. Then he continued his patrol, boots echoing against stone. But the intensity of his scrutiny left an unsettling question hanging in the air, like morning mist. Why would anyone watch a common slave child with such careful attention, as if she were not just property but a potential threat? 2 years had carved their passage into Alara's bones. The kitchen slave with perpetually raw hands had grown taller, thinner, and infinitely more observant. At 12, she had mastered the invisible art that kept servants alive, the ability to see without being seen, to hear without appearing to listen. Her eyes, once wide with terror, now catalogued the castle's rhythms with calculated precision. She knew which nobles paid their debts and which accumulated secrets like treasure. She recognized when the cook's temper would flare based on the set of her shoulders, and which guards might offer scraps when no one was watching. This intelligence, quietly accumulating like dust in forgotten corners, had not gone unnoticed. Other servants whispered about the girl who never spoke unless necessary but seemed to absorb everything. Some found comfort in her silent competence, others grew uneasy at her watchful gaze. What they couldn't know was how each observation formed another piece of an internal map, a geography of power that Alara constructed night after night while curled on her thin pallet. On this particular morning, her fingers worked methodically through a mountain of vegetable peelings, her muscles moving with efficient memory, while her attention drifted upward to the heated conversation between 2 ladies' maids gossiping nearby. Their voices lowered conspiratorially as they discussed the queen's missing sapphire necklace, a priceless heirloom that had vanished from the royal chambers overnight. "The queen is beside herself," whispered the older maid, her fingers anxiously pleating her apron. "Lord Cavendish says the punishment will be severe. They're searching the servants' quarters as we speak," the younger one replied, a tremor of fear threading through her words. "Anyone found with it will hang before sunset." A cold weight settled in Alara's stomach. Castle justice was swift and rarely concerned with evidence when servants stood accused. The vegetable knife in her hand suddenly felt dangerous to hold, as if the mere act of touching it might somehow implicate her. She kept her head down, her movements steady despite the nervous flutter beneath her ribs. By midday, the castle had transformed into a hive of suspicion. Guards stalked through the lower levels with unprecedented scrutiny, upending sleeping pallets and searching personal belongings with impunity. Serving girls wept as treasured trinkets, a mother's ribbon, a lover's carved token, were tossed aside in the search. Alara watched it all with a face carefully emptied of emotion, though her heart hammered against her chest like a trapped bird. The head cook slammed a copper pot onto the hearth with unusual force. "Back to work, all of you. The nobles still expect to eat whether jewels are missing or not." Her voice carried the edge of genuine fear beneath its harshness. They all knew that failure in the kitchens would be blamed on her leadership, It happened just as Alara was carrying a heavy bucket of wash water across the kitchen. The captain of the guard entered with 4 armed men, their expressions grim beneath their helmets. The room fell silent, the usual clatter of kitchen work suspended in the sudden tension. "Everyone against the wall," the captain ordered, his voice slicing through the stillness. Alara moved to comply, but a strange sensation prickled at the back of her neck. One of the guards, the same one who had watched her that first night 2 years ago, was staring at her with peculiar intensity. His hand rested too casually on his sword hilt, his posture too deliberate. Something flickered in his eyes that made her blood run cold. Without warning, he strode toward her. "Empty your pockets, girl." Her throat constricted. "I have no pockets, sir." The ragged dress she wore had been patched countless times but never afforded such luxuries. "Your sleeping place, then." "Where is it?" She led them to her corner, where her thin blanket lay folded beside the only possession she had managed to keep hidden all this time. Her rag doll, now so dirty and worn that its original color was a mere memory. The guard upended the blanket with the tip of his boot. Nothing. Then his gloved hand reached for the doll. "Please," Alara whispered, the word escaping before she could catch it. "It's just—" The guard tore the doll's head from its body, and there, glittering with impossible brilliance against the doll's dirty stuffing, lay the queen's sapphire necklace. The kitchen fell deathly silent. Alara's lungs seemed to forget their purpose as she stared at the impossible contradiction before her. Her hands trembled visibly now, no longer able to maintain the careful control she had cultivated over 2 years of servitude. "I didn't—" she began, but the guard's gauntleted hand closed around her arm with bruising force. "Thief," he pronounced, and in that single word, Alara heard her death sentence. They dragged her through corridors she had never been permitted to enter, past tapestries depicting battles and coronations, down spiraling stone stairs that descended deeper than she had known the castle reached. The air grew colder, damper, thick with the smell of mold and human suffering. Iron sconces held sputtering torches that cast more shadows than light, transforming the guards into monstrous silhouettes. The dungeon engulfed her like a stone throat swallowing prey whole. Cells lined the narrow passageway, most empty, but some containing huddled shapes that might once have been human. Moans occasionally punctuated the heavy silence. The guards thrust her into a cell where the ceiling hung so low she could not stand upright. The door clanged shut with finality, the lock's mechanism grinding into place. "The council will decide your fate tomorrow," the captain said without emotion. "Though stealing from Her Majesty herself leaves little room for mercy." Left alone in the suffocating darkness, Alara finally surrendered to the sobs that had built inside her chest. Her wrists burned where manacles now chafed against skin that had only recently healed from previous shackles. The bitter irony was not lost on her. Traded as property, now imprisoned as a criminal. New chains replaced old ones. As night descended fully, bringing a bone-deep chill to her cell, Alara's tears eventually subsided into empty exhaustion. The distant drip of water marked time with maddening irregularity. Her fingers traced the rough stone wall, mapping her new prison as she had once mapped the kitchen. But here, there were no patterns to learn, no rhythms to anticipate, only waiting. A rustling sound from the neighboring cell startled her from half-sleep. A deep voice, rough with disuse but carrying an unexpected hint of education, broke through the darkness. "They've sent a child to the dungeon. The kingdom has fallen further than I realized." Alara hesitated before responding. "I'm accused of stealing the queen's necklace." A dry, humorless laugh answered her. "And did you?" "No," she whispered fiercely. "It was placed in my doll. I never touched it." Silence stretched between them until the voice spoke again. "That suggests an interesting question, doesn't it? Not who stole the necklace, but who wanted you blamed for it." The words sent an electric current of realization through her. Someone had deliberately chosen her, the most insignificant of servants, as their scapegoat. But why? What threat could a kitchen slave possibly pose? "Who are you?" she ventured. "Once I was the king's scholar," the voice replied with a trace of bitterness. "Now I'm a man who knows too many dangerous truths, and you, child, have just become another casualty of a game much larger than either of us. In the darkness, Ilara's eyes widened as she processed his words. The scholar leaned closer to the wall separating their cells, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Listen carefully. If you survive until tomorrow night, I will teach you things they never intended someone like you to know. How to read their secrets, how to understand their power. Knowledge they believe belongs only to them. His offer hung in the damp air between them. Impossible and dangerous, and potentially transformative. Ilara felt something stir within her that she had thought long extinguished. Hope, sharp-edged and precarious. "Why would you help me?" she asked, suspicion threading through her voice. His response came after a weighted pause, each word deliberately chosen. "Because I see something in your eyes that they've tried to break but couldn't. And because sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply someone who can witness it and remember." Outside their cells, the shuffle of a guard's footsteps approached. Both prisoners fell silent instantly, reverting to the protective invisibility that survival demanded. But as darkness enveloped them once more, an unspoken question remained. Would learning forbidden knowledge save her, or condemn her to an even more terrible fate? Shadows danced across the damp stone walls as Ilara's fingers traced unfamiliar symbols by torchlight. 1 year had passed since her imprisonment, a year measured not in seasons but in knowledge painfully acquired. At 13, her hands bore new calluses, not from kitchen labor but from scraping makeshift charcoal against stone, practicing letters until her fingertips bled. The old scholar, Aldrich, had proven true to his word, teaching her through the wall that separated their cells each night when the guards grew lax in their vigilance. Again, his gravelly voice instructed from the darkness. The symbol for decree is often followed by the royal seal. You must recognize it instantly. Ilara's brow furrowed with concentration as she repeated the pattern, her muscles memorizing what her mind already knew. Hunger gnawed at her stomach. The prisoner's rations had been halved again, but she forced the discomfort aside. Physical pain had become a constant companion, less important than the burning need to absorb every fragment of knowledge Aldrich offered. "Good," he murmured, approval warming his typically austere tone. "You learn faster than any student I taught at court." A flush of pride warmed her cheeks, quickly tamped down by hard-learned caution. Pride was dangerous. It led to mistakes. Yet she couldn't deny the fierce satisfaction that came with each new understanding, each forbidden skill. What had begun as simple letters had evolved into complex political symbols, economic notations, and the secret language of court documents. "Tomorrow," Aldrich whispered, "we begin deciphering tax records." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning beyond their simple sound. Tax records were the lifeblood of the kingdom and potentially its greatest vulnerability. Even in the dungeon, rumors filtered down about increased levies crushing the peasantry, about villages emptied by starvation while nobles' tables groaned with excess. That night, curled on the damp straw that served as her bed, Ilara closed her eyes and practiced the symbols in her mind. Sleep came fitfully, broken by the constant sounds of suffering that permeated the dungeon. Moans, occasional screams, the rattling breath of those approaching death. The prison had thinned her body but sharpened her mind, honing it into something dangerous and unexpected. The guard who brought their morning gruel was new, younger than most, with hands that trembled slightly as he pushed the bowls through the narrow slots in their cell doors. Ilara watched him from beneath lowered lashes, noting his poorly fitted uniform, the way his eyes darted nervously toward the stairwell. When he reached her cell, he hesitated, then quickly slipped something beside her bowl. A folded scrap of parchment, barely visible in the dim light. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she gave no outward sign of noticing. Only when his footsteps faded did she cautiously retrieve the paper, concealing it within her tattered sleeve. Aldrich's warning echoed in her mind. Trust creates vulnerabilities they will exploit without hesitation. Hours later, when the dungeon fell into its midday lull, that brief period when guard shifts changed and attention wavered, she carefully unfolded the parchment. It contained a crude map of the lower dungeons, with a small cross marking what appeared to be a forgotten passage. At the bottom, hastily scrawled, "Tomorrow, midnight, one chance." Her throat constricted. An escape opportunity? Or an elaborate trap to justify her execution? She pressed her lips together, mind racing through possibilities with the analytical precision Aldrich had cultivated in her. "What troubles you, child?" Aldrich's voice drifted through the wall, uncannily attuned to her silence. She hesitated before whispering, knowledge that could mean freedom or death. A long pause followed. "Show me nothing," he finally replied. "Tell me nothing. But remember that some risks are necessary when the alternative is certain doom." That evening, a commotion erupted in the upper levels of the dungeon. Guards rushed toward the disturbance, their boots echoing on stone steps. Taking advantage of their distraction, Aldrich slid a thin object through a crack in their adjoining wall, a rolled parchment, yellowed with age. "This was meant for a different purpose," he murmured, "but perhaps fate had other plans. If you find your way out, take it with you. What it contains could upend the kingdom." Ilara's fingers closed around the scroll, its texture foreign yet somehow familiar after months of handling smuggled scraps for her lessons. She tucked it into the secret pocket she'd sewn into her ragged dress, next to her heart. "And you?" she whispered. His soft laugh held no mirth. "My journey ends here, child. Yours is just beginning." Sleep eluded her completely that night. Every sound, every shift of the guard's position registered with painful clarity as she lay motionless, calculating, planning. The midnight hour approached with excruciating slowness, marked by water dripping somewhere in the darkness. When the dungeon bell tolled midnight, Ilara counted 30 heartbeats before easing herself up. The lock on her cell door, supposedly impenetrable, met with the thin metal pick the young guard had hidden beneath her food bowl. Aldrich had taught her the theory of lock mechanisms. Desperation guided her fingers through the practical application. The lock yielded with a soft click that sounded thunderous in the silence. "Godspeed," Aldrich whispered as she slipped from her cell. "I'll return for you," she promised, the words catching in her throat. His reply was barely audible. "No, you won't." The chill of the stone floor seeped through her bare feet as she navigated the darkened passageway, pressing herself against walls when guards' voices echoed from adjoining corridors. The map guided her to a section of wall that appeared identical to all others, except for a faint discoloration in the mortar between stones. Her fingers, sensitive from months of tracing letters, detected the slight difference in texture that eyes would miss. She pressed, twisted, and the wall yielded, revealing a narrow passage thick with cobwebs and the musty scent of long, undisturbed air. Ilara hesitated at the threshold. One step would commit her to a path from which she could never return. The darkness beyond promised either freedom or a more elaborate trap. The scroll pressed against her chest beneath her dress, its presence a physical reminder of what was at stake. She stepped forward. The passage wound downward, narrowing until she was forced to turn sideways to continue. The absolute darkness disoriented her, leaving only touch to guide her progress. Her lungs burned with the effort of breathing the stale air as fear threatened to overwhelm her hard-won composure. Just as panic began to rise, her questing fingers encountered a different texture, wood rather than stone. A door, its hinges rusted with age and disuse. It resisted her initial push, then yielded with a groan that seemed to echo through the passage. Beyond lay not the freedom she had dared to hope for, but a chamber unlike any she had seen before. Torches burned in sconces along the walls, illuminating shelves upon shelves of scrolls, books, and documents. A library, hidden beneath the castle dungeons, its existence apparently forgotten by all but the young guard who had given her the map. The air felt different here, less oppressive, tinged with the scent of parchment and ink rather than human suffering. Ilara moved cautiously among the shelves, her eyes widening at the sheer volume of written knowledge surrounding her. Aldrich had spoken of the royal archives with reverence, but this was something else entirely, a collection deliberately hidden, its contents deemed too dangerous for ordinary access. Her fingers trailed across spines and scroll cases, recognizing symbols Aldrich had taught her: taxation, military strategy, royal lineage, court judgments. One shelf drew her attention, documents bearing the king's seal but marked with the additional symbol for fabricated. False documents, created to justify actions the crown wished to take. With trembling hands, she unrolled one such scroll. Even with her limited reading skills, the contents chilled her blood. It detailed necessary taxation for defense of the realm, triple the amount legally permitted, with instructions on how to disguise the theft as essential expenditure. Marginalia in a precise hand noted which villages could be taxed to extinction without causing undue disruption to the supply of laborers. Villages like the one she had come from. Families like hers, driven to sell their children to avoid starvation, never knowing that their hunger was by royal design rather than misfortune. The revelation struck her with physical force, doubling her over as if from a blow. All her life she had believed her fate the result of cruel circumstance, her father's desperation, her own bad luck. Now she understood it as the deliberate consequence of systematic theft disguised as governance. Knowledge transformed fear into something more dangerous, rage with purpose, anger with direction. Her hands shook, not with terror, but with the enormity of what she now possessed, truth that could ignite revolution if revealed. The sound of approaching footsteps shattered her revelation. Someone else knew of this chamber. Someone was coming. Quickly, she rolled the damning document and tucked it within her dress alongside Aldrich's scroll. Then, concealing herself behind a shelf, she prepared to either flee or fight. As a shadow fell across the doorway, Ilara held her breath, her heart thundering so loudly she feared it would betray her position. Should she run or remain hidden? Attack or surrender? Every muscle tensed with readiness as she weighed her limited options. The moment stretched into an unbearable silence. Then a voice, barely audible, yet unmistakable, whispered into the stillness, "I know you're here. And now you know too much to ever go back." Ilara's muscles tensed, ready to spring like a cornered animal as the figure stepped fully into the torchlight. She recognized him immediately, the young guard who had slipped her the map. Up close, she noticed details that had escaped her before. A thin scar bisecting his left eyebrow, calloused hands that suggested a life of labor before donning a castle uniform, eyes that held knowledge beyond their years. "My name is Thorn," he said quietly, keeping his distance as if approaching a wild creature. "And you have just discovered what few living souls know, the true machinery of power in this kingdom." She remained silent, calculating the distance to the door behind him, weighing whether she could outrun him in her weakened state. "I won't stop you if you choose to flee," he continued, reading her thoughts with unnerving accuracy. "But where would you go? A girl alone in prison rags carrying treasonous documents? You wouldn't survive 2 days." His logic struck her like a physical blow. Freedom without purpose was merely a different kind of death sentence. "Why show me this?" she finally asked, her voice rough from disuse. "Why risk everything to free a kitchen girl accused of theft?" A mirthless smile touched his lips. "Because you're not just any kitchen girl. You're the one who survived 2 years of observation without breaking. The one who learned letters and symbols through a stone wall, who solved locks designed to be impenetrable." He paused, letting his words sink in. "More importantly, you're the one they went to extraordinary lengths to silence, planting the Queen's necklace in your possession when you became too observant." The revelation clicked into place like a key in a lock. She hadn't been imprisoned for being a thief, but for seeing too much, remembering too clearly, understanding the patterns of power that servants weren't meant to comprehend. "There are others," Thorn continued, "throughout the castle and beyond. People who know the truth about how this kingdom is bled dry to feed the excesses of a few. People waiting for the right moment, the right evidence, the right spark." His words hung in the air between them, charged with dangerous possibility. Ilara's mind raced through implications, connections forming between scattered fragments of knowledge, kitchen gossip, Aldrich's lessons, the damning documents before her. "You want me to help start a rebellion?" she stated flatly, not a question, but a realization. Thorn's expression remained carefully neutral. "I want you to share what you know with those who need to hear it. The knowledge you've gained isn't meant to die in these chambers. Every scrap of evidence you can memorize, every corrupt decree you can explain in common language, these become weapons more powerful than swords." A distant shout echoed from somewhere above, reminding them of the precarious nature of their meeting. Thorn tensed, listening for approaching footsteps. "Your absence will be discovered soon," he warned. "There are tunnels below this chamber that lead beyond the castle walls. You need to decide, disappear forever, or become something they never anticipated." The choice crystallized before her with stark clarity: freedom without purpose, or purpose fraught with mortal danger. Alara's fingers brushed against the scrolls hidden against her heart, physical evidence of systematic cruelty disguised as governance. "I'll need to contact others like us," she said. "Decision made. People who can spread the truth." Relief washed briefly across Thorn's face before his expression hardened into determination. He quickly outlined a network of sympathizers: a blacksmith whose family had been ruined by false taxation, a tavern keeper who served as message hub, former soldiers disillusioned by commands to suppress starving villagers. "Memorize these names," he instructed, "but never write them down. Trust is our only currency." By morning, whispers of the dungeon escape had begun circulating through the castle's lower levels. Servants exchanged furtive glances as guards stormed through kitchens and stables, searching for the vanished prisoner. What started as simple gossip transformed with surprising speed. The story of a girl who had mysteriously escaped impenetrable cells took on new dimensions with each retelling. "She knew things," a scullery maid whispered to the butcher's boy. "Read papers she wasn't supposed to see." The queen herself ordered her locked away. Added a stable hand, embellishing liberally. "I heard she stole secrets, not jewels," contributed a laundress. The guard captain, red-faced with rage and fear, ordered silence, but the damage was done. The idea had taken root. Someone had defied the system and disappeared like morning mist. It was small comfort to those still trapped in servitude, but comfort nonetheless. In the royal chambers, the queen paced anxiously as her chief advisor delivered news of the escape. "A mere inconvenience," he assured her, though the tightness around his eyes betrayed deeper concern. "The girl is unimportant, illiterate, powerless." "Then why did you insist on framing her?" the queen demanded, her fingers worrying at a loose thread in her sleeve. "Why not simply dismiss her if she was merely a troublesome servant?" The advisor's pause lasted a heartbeat too long. "Precautionary measures, Your Majesty. The girl had an unfortunate habit of being present during sensitive conversations." What he didn't say, couldn't say, was how the child's unflinching gaze had unsettled him. How her perfect recall of details mentioned months earlier had raised alarms among those accustomed to servants with conveniently poor memories. Some threats were recognized only by instinct, like the prickling awareness of a predator hidden in tall grass. Meanwhile, beyond the castle walls, Ilara moved through shadows with newfound purpose. Thorn's network embraced her with cautious optimism, providing humble shelter and plain clothes to replace her prison rags. For the first time in years, she slept without chains or bars, though her dreams remained confined to stone walls and darkness. The blacksmith, a mountain of a man named Fergus, listened in stunned silence as she recited from memory the falsified tax documents that had ruined his family's forge. His massive hands trembled with restrained fury. "All this time," he whispered, "we believed it was fate or bad fortune, not deliberate theft." "They count on that belief," Ilara replied, Aldrich's teachings flowing through her. "Acceptance is easier than rebellion." The tavern keeper, a sharp-eyed woman called Marta who missed nothing that occurred in her establishment, provided the perfect environment for quiet dissemination of dangerous knowledge. Laborers, merchants, and occasional off-duty guards gathered under her smoky rafters, where conversations flowed as freely as ale. Here, Ilara learned to transform complex political machinations into stories ordinary people could grasp and repeat. The northern village wasn't destroyed by bandits, she would explain to a wide-eyed audience. The royal decree ordered troops there after they refused a third taxation in one season. I've seen the documents myself. With each passing day, her legend grew, transforming from gossip to something more dangerous: hope. The ghost of the dungeons, some called her, while others used "the girl who remembers" in hushed tones. Her actual presence remained hidden, but her knowledge spread like fire in dry brush. The council, alarmed by growing unrest, increased military presence throughout the city. Guards harassed merchants for minor infractions, imposed curfews, interrogated anyone suspected of spreading malicious falsehoods against the crown. Their heavy-handed approach served only to confirm the whispered accusations. One evening, as Alara slipped through back alleys toward a meeting point, a small object skittered across the cobblestones before her feet, a folded piece of parchment wrapped around a stone. She retrieved it cautiously, unfolding it in the dim light of a distant street lamp. The message was brief, written in a familiar hand. "I know who you are." Ice crystallized in her veins. Was it a threat? A warning? The handwriting offered no clues to the sender's identity or intentions. She quickly scanned the shadows surrounding her, but the narrow street remained eerily empty. Someone was watching, had perhaps been watching for some time. Upon reaching the safety of Marta's back room, Alara shared the message with Thorn, whose face drained of color. "The phrasing," he muttered. "It's identical to messages received by 2 other members of our network last week. Both disappeared within days." Fear, her constant companion since childhood, threatened to overwhelm Alara's hard-won composure. She had escaped physical chains only to discover invisible ones. The weight of responsibility, the constant danger of discovery, the lives that now depended on her continued freedom. "Should we relocate you?" Thorn asked, concern etching lines around his eyes. "Perhaps the northern settlements—" "No," Alara interrupted, surprising herself with her vehemence. "Whoever sent this wants exactly that, to disrupt our work, to isolate me from the network. We continue as planned." But that night, alone in her small room above the tavern, doubt crept in like the damp cold. Her fingers traced the mysterious message by candlelight, searching for clues in the formation of each letter. Who knew her identity? How had they found her? And most troubling, what did they want? Sleep, when it finally claimed her, brought vivid dreams of Aldrich's voice whispering warnings she couldn't quite hear, of hidden passages leading nowhere, of documents whose words rearranged themselves as she tried to read them. She woke with a gasp just before dawn, the message still clutched in her hand, crumpled by her restless sleep. The single candle had burned out, leaving the room in pre-dawn darkness. As her eyes adjusted, she became aware of something different, an object on the rough wooden floor that hadn't been there when she'd fallen asleep. A small package wrapped in coarse cloth. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she cautiously retrieved it, unwrapping layers to reveal its contents. A small brass key, its design unlike any she had seen in the castle. Attached was a scrap of parchment bearing only 3 words: Royal Treasury, Midnight. The invitation, or trap, could not have been more explicit, or more dangerous. The brass key felt unnaturally heavy in Alara's palm, its weight disproportionate to its size, much like the decision it represented. At 14, she had become something beyond a mere escaped prisoner. The whispered name, Ghost of the Dungeons, followed her like a shadow, transforming her from person to symbol with alarming speed. "It's obviously a trap," Thorn insisted, pacing the small back room of Marta's tavern where their core group had gathered for an emergency meeting. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the hilt of his dagger. "The Royal Treasury is the most heavily guarded chamber in the castle. Even if that key is genuine, which I doubt, you'd never make it past the 3rd checkpoint." Fergus the blacksmith nodded in solemn agreement, his massive arms crossed over his chest. "They're growing desperate to silence you. This reeks of desperation." Alara remained silent, turning the key over in her fingers, studying its intricate notches with the analytical precision Aldrich had cultivated in her. The craftsmanship was exceptional. Not a forgery made to lure her, but a genuine article stolen at great risk. Whoever had delivered this invitation had access to the kingdom's most protected spaces. "What if it isn't a trap?" she finally asked, her voice cutting through their concerned murmurs. "What if someone inside the power structure itself has decided to help us?" Marta, who had been quietly listening from her position by the door, stepped forward, lines of worry etched deeper into her weathered face. "Even if that were true, child, the risk remains the same. One girl against the Royal Guard is no contest, ally or no ally." Alara's gaze dropped to the rough wooden table between them, where maps of the castle and surrounding city had been meticulously sketched from memory. 14 months had passed since her escape from the dungeons. In that time, their network had grown from a handful of disillusioned citizens to a coordinated web of informants, messengers, and sympathizers spanning every level of society, except the highest echelons of power. That remained their greatest weakness. They could spread truth among the common folk, but without evidence that would compel nobles to question their loyalty to the crown, any uprising would be ruthlessly crushed by military force. The treasury wouldn't just hold gold, she said slowly, piecing together the implications. It would contain records of every transaction, every bribe, every misappropriation of funds, actual proof of what we've only been able to describe secondhand. The room fell silent as her words sank in. Such evidence would transform rumors into irrefutable truth, the kind that could sway merchant guilds, minor nobility, even ranking military officers whose loyalty depended on the belief that they served an imperfect but fundamentally legitimate authority. Even if you succeeded, Thorne said quietly, they would know immediately who had breached their security. You would never escape the castle a second time. A bitter smile touched Alara's lips. Perhaps that's not the point. Perhaps whoever sent this key doesn't expect me to escape. Fergus slammed his palm against the table, making the candles jump. Then it's suicide, plain and simple. We won't allow it. Allow? The word hung between them, sharp as a blade. Alara's eyes, no longer those of a child despite her youth, fixed on each of them in turn. Was I rescued from the dungeon simply to be controlled by different hands? Am I a tool for your rebellion, or am I its voice? The uncomfortable silence that followed confirmed what she had begun to suspect in recent weeks. They saw her as valuable, perhaps irreplaceable, but not as an equal partner in their conspiracy. Her youth and gender remained invisible barriers to full acceptance of her judgment. The king issued a new decree yesterday. She continued into the strained quiet. Any village unable to meet increased taxation will have half its population conscripted for labor camps in the northern mines. Not as punishment, but as debt service. They're creating a system of legalized slavery that will consume entire communities. Marta's hand flew to her mouth. The northern mines kill men within 2 years from the dust alone. Precisely. Alara's voice hardened. So while we debate my safety, thousands face a death sentence delivered in the language of fiscal responsibility. She closed her fingers around the key, decision made. I'm going, alone, as the invitation clearly intends. The rest of you will continue our work regardless of the outcome. Their protests washed over her like rain against stone, unable to erode her resolution. By evening, reluctant preparations had been made. Thorne provided a rough layout of the treasury approaches based on his knowledge of castle guard rotations. Fergus contributed a set of slender metal picks that could supplement the mysterious key if needed. Marta altered a serving girl's dress to fit Alara's thin frame, adding hidden pockets for tools and documents. As midnight approached, Alara stood at the castle's servants' entrance, unrecognizable from the half-starved prisoner who had escaped its dungeons. Her hair, once matted and filthy, was neatly braided beneath a modest cap. Her posture mimicked the efficient, slightly hurried bearing of girls delivering late-night refreshments to noble chambers. Only her eyes remained unchanged, watchful, calculating, missing nothing. The first 2 checkpoints proved unexpectedly simple to navigate. A guard at the outer gate waved her through with barely a glance at her covered basket of sweet pastries, supposedly destined for Lord Cavendish's notorious midnight appetites. Another guard, half asleep at his post in a lesser-used corridor, accepted her explanation about taking a wrong turn with weary indifference. It was at the 3rd checkpoint that certainty crystallized. This was indeed no ordinary trap. The guard station outside the treasury antechamber stood eerily empty, the usual pair of elite soldiers conspicuously absent. Someone had deliberately cleared her path, which meant someone with significant authority wanted her inside that treasury. The brass key slid into the ornate lock with perfect precision. The heavy door swung open on silent, well-oiled hinges, revealing a chamber that gleamed dully with the wealth of an entire kingdom. gold and silver coins in neat stacks, gemstones categorized by type and size, elaborate ceremonial objects whose value could feed entire villages for years, all cataloged and displayed with meticulous attention. But it was the records room adjoining the main chamber that drew Ilara forward. Shelves lined with leather-bound ledgers stretched from floor to ceiling, each volume representing tax collection from a different region, each page containing the financial life and death of communities she had only heard named in passing. "I wondered if you would come." The voice from the shadows nearly stopped her heart. A hooded figure emerged from between the shelves, face obscured but posture unmistakably regal. Not a guard or advisor, but someone accustomed to power as a birthright. The figure pushed back the hood to reveal an elegant woman in her middle years, her features composed but eyes burning with barely contained emotion. "The Queen," Ilara breathed, instinctively dropping into the curtsy that had been beaten into her during her kitchen service. "No need for that," the Queen said, her voice simultaneously commanding and weary. "Formality seems rather pointless when treason is being discussed." Ilara remained frozen, mind racing through possibilities, none of them ending with her survival. The Queen, architect of her imprisonment, ultimate authority behind the corrupt system she had been fighting, had personally arranged this meeting. "You're wondering why I would summon the realm's most wanted fugitive into the heart of royal security," the Queen continued, gesturing toward a specific ledger on a nearby table. "The answer lies there, in what you might call the true record of the kingdom." With cautious movements, Ilara approached the indicated volume. Its pages revealed a system far more twisted than even their network had uncovered. Not merely corruption, but systematic plunder orchestrated not by the royal family, but by a shadow council of advisors who had effectively imprisoned the monarchs in a web of manufactured crises, false information, and subtle threats. "They keep us alive as figureheads," the Queen explained, bitterness edging her words. "The king signs decrees he doesn't write or fully comprehend. I preside over ceremonies while villages burn. We are controlled through our son's safety and our own ignorance." Understanding dawned like a cold sunrise. "You're as much a prisoner as I was. In gilded chains, but chains nonetheless." The Queen's gaze intensified. "When you were accused of stealing my necklace, a theft I knew immediately was fabricated, I began to question other truths I had been told. Your escape from an inescapable dungeon confirmed my suspicions that forces within the castle operated beyond my knowledge." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper, though they were alone. "What I could not anticipate was how a kitchen girl would transform into the voice of revolution, articulating injustices I had been deliberately kept blind to. Your growing influence forced the council to reveal more of their true operations to justify increased security measures." Ilara's mind raced ahead of the conversation, assembling implications with frightening speed. "You want me to expose them, not just to the common people, but to the power structure itself." "I want you to survive the night," the Queen corrected sharply. "Take what documents you need from this room, then follow the passage behind the third shelf. It leads to the castle gardens. Guards have been redirected for exactly 17 minutes. Beyond that, your fate rests in your own hands." A final devastating question forced its way past Ilara's caution. "Why not simply assert your authority? You're still queen." Something like shame flickered across the royal face. "Because power wielded without understanding causes as much harm as deliberate cruelty. Because they hold my son's future as hostage against my cooperation. And because sometimes salvation must come from beyond the walls we've built around ourselves." She stepped back into shadow. 14 minutes remain. Choose wisely. Left alone among the kingdom's darkest secrets, Ilara faced the most complex puzzle of her young life. Which documents would provide irrefutable proof? Which would compel action from those with power to effect change? And most troublingly, could she trust the Queen's apparent alliance, or was this the most elaborate trap yet? The clock's steady tick counted down her remaining time as her fingers danced across ledgers and scrolls, selecting evidence with surgical precision. Every instinct screamed danger, yet opportunity had never worn a more convincing disguise. 13 precious minutes remained when Ilara made her decision. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency, selecting documents that formed an undeniable pattern of corruption. Each scroll and ledger page disappeared into the hidden pockets of her servant's dress, not randomly chosen, but carefully curated to tell a specific story that even the most skeptical noble would be unable to dismiss. The third bookshelf yielded to her touch exactly as the queen had indicated, revealing a narrow passage thick with cobwebs and the musty scent of disuse. Ilara hesitated at the threshold, every instinct honed by years of survival screaming caution. The queen's assistance seemed too convenient, too perfectly timed. Yet the documents now pressed against her body were undeniably authentic, their value too great to ignore regardless of the motivation behind their offering. Taking a deep breath of stale air, she stepped into darkness. The passage twisted downward in a tight spiral, requiring her to feel her way forward with outstretched hands against damp stone walls. Roots from ancient trees had broken through in places, creating natural handholds that guided her descent. Time seemed suspended in the absolute blackness, with only her controlled breathing and the occasional scurry of unseen creatures marking its passage. When her fingers finally encountered wood instead of stone, she almost sobbed with relief. A small door, swollen with moisture, required her full weight to push open. It yielded with a protesting groan, revealing the castle gardens bathed in moonlight so bright it momentarily blinded her. The night air struck her lungs like sweet wine after the stifling passage. Garden paths stretched before her, meticulously maintained even in darkness, offering multiple routes to the outer walls. She chose the path bordered by tall rose bushes, their thorns providing both concealment and warning against anyone approaching too closely. She was halfway to the garden's edge when a shadow detached itself from a nearby hedge. "You actually succeeded," Thorn whispered, materializing beside her with the silent movement that made him valuable as both guard and spy. "We feared the worst when you missed the arranged signal." Anger flashed through her despite the relief of seeing a friendly face. "You were ordered to maintain distance. This location could be watched." "It is," he confirmed grimly, "by me and 3 others from our network. We've been monitoring castle security movements all night. Something unprecedented is happening. Half the Royal Guard abandoned standard patrol routes an hour before your arrival." Cold dread pooled in Ilara's stomach. "The Queen?" "Precisely. Either she's helping you or using you as bait in some larger scheme. Either way, we need to move. Now." They slipped through shadows toward the least defended section of the garden wall, where ancient ivy had created natural handholds in the weathered stone. Guards shouted in the distance. The treasury breach had been discovered sooner than expected. The methodical rhythm of armored footsteps grew closer with each passing second. Thorn boosted Ilara toward the ivy-covered wall, his strong hands providing the leverage her exhausted body needed. "Go. The others will create a diversion to cover your escape." Her fingers dug into the tangled vines, finding purchase as she pulled herself upward. "And you?" His smile flashed white in the darkness. "I'll be right behind you." It was the first lie he had ever told her. As Ilara reached the top of the wall, torchlight flooded the garden below. Shouts erupted as guards spotted Thorn, who had deliberately moved into open ground away from her position. He drew his sword, a futile gesture against 6 armed men, and charged directly toward them, creating precious seconds for her to disappear over the wall's edge. Ilara bit back a scream as she witnessed his capture, knowing any sound would render his sacrifice meaningless. Tears blurred her vision as she descended the outer face of the wall, each handhold found by touch rather than sight. The documents pressed against her heart felt suddenly heavier, weighted with new responsibility. By dawn, she had reached the network's emergency shelter, an abandoned mill whose water wheel still turned, providing constant sound to mask conversations. Marta and Fergus listened in stunned silence as she recounted the night's events, their expressions shifting from relief to suspicion to horror as the story unfolded. "The Queen herself?" Marta whispered, hands trembling as she poured herb-infused tea to calm their nerves. "Either she's sincere, which means the entire power structure is more fractured than we realized, or this is the most elaborate trap ever conceived," Fergus finished, his blacksmith's hands uncharacteristically gentle as he examined the documents Ilara had retrieved. "These are authentic, no question. Royal seals, private notations, materials only available to the treasury, but their very authenticity could be the bait. Alara sipped the bitter tea, forcing her mind to function despite exhaustion. Thorn is captured. Whether the Queen's offer was genuine or false, the Council now knows exactly how much evidence we possess. The implications hung heavy in the pre-dawn air. Their network, built on anonymity and careful compartmentalization, had suffered its first major breach. Thorn knew names, locations, signals. Under sufficient pressure, any man would eventually break. "We need to move now," Alara decided, setting down her cup with finality. Not to hide, but to strike. Fergus's bushy eyebrows rose toward his hairline. "Strike? Child, we've lost our most valuable castle informant and gained the undivided attention of the Royal Guard. This is the moment to scatter and regroup, not to attack." "That's exactly what they'll expect," Alara countered, spreading the stolen documents across the rough wooden table. "Look at these records. The Council isn't just stealing from peasants. They're diverting funds meant for military salaries, embezzling tax revenue earmarked for noble houses, falsifying trade agreements with neighboring kingdoms. They've made enemies at every level of society." Her finger traced the signature at the bottom of a particularly damning ledger. "Lord Cavendish's personal seal approves moving garrison funds to special projects, meaning his own coffers, while soldiers' families starve. Captain Draymont of the Eastern Division lost 30 men to desertion last month when promised supplies never arrived. The merchant guilds paid tariffs for royal protection on the North Road, yet 3 major caravans were lost to bandits that survivors described as wearing mismatched pieces of royal armor." Understanding dawned across Marta's weathered features. "You're suggesting we don't just spread this information among the common folk. We deliver specific evidence to those with power and reason to act," Alara confirmed, "not as vague rumors or tavern gossip, but as proven facts that threaten their own interests." It was a strategy Aldrich would have appreciated, using the self-interest of the powerful as leverage where appeals to justice had failed. For 3 days, they worked without rest, creating meticulous copies of select documents tailored to specific recipients. A merchant guildmaster received proof that his tax payments never reached royal coffers. A minor noble family was shown evidence that their declining fortunes resulted not from poor harvests, but from systematic theft. Military officers received documentation explaining why promised supplies and reinforcements had never materialized. Each message included a single consistent element: an invitation to a clandestine gathering at the old cathedral, long abandoned after lightning had destroyed its spire, but still standing on the city's edge. A neutral ground where ancient laws of sanctuary still held meaning, where grievances might be aired without immediate bloodshed. On the appointed night, Alara approached the cathedral alone despite vehement protests from her allies. Moonlight filtered through the damaged roof, casting silver patterns across weathered stone floors. The nave stood empty but for shadows and the weight of centuries, until precisely midnight, when figures began emerging from side chapels and concealed doorways. They came one by one, faces partially concealed by cloaks and hoods, suspicion evident in their cautious movements. Merchants whose wealth bought influence but never respect. Minor nobility whose ancient names carried honor but dwindling power. Military officers whose loyalty to the crown had been tested by years of broken promises. Even 2 members of the Royal Guard, men whose families had served the throne for generations, now questioning whether they defended a kingdom or merely its corrupt stewards. Last to arrive was a slender figure whose bearing announced royal blood more clearly than any crown. The Queen herself, flanked not by guards but by a single companion whose scholarly stoop and familiar voice froze Alara mid-breath. "Aldrich," she whispered, disbelieving. The old scholar's eyes crinkled with recognition, though his face remained grave. "My finest student, it seems your education continues to bear unexpected fruit." Before she could respond, the Queen stepped forward, addressing the gathered assembly. "I believe many of you expected treachery tonight. Perhaps you came prepared to expose a rebel plot, or to gather intelligence for your own protection." Her voice carried the practiced authority of one born to command. "Instead, I offer you truth that will shatter any remaining illusions about who truly rules this kingdom." She gestured toward Alara, whose heart hammered against her ribs as dozens of suspicious eyes turned in her direction. This child, once a kitchen slave, later a prisoner, now called by some the ghost of the dungeons, will show you precisely how your loyalty has been abused and your trust betrayed. Alara stepped into the pool of moonlight, clutching documents that represented both her greatest vulnerability and her only power. As she began to speak, she felt the weight of Aldrich's approving gaze and the feather-light touch of possibility. That perhaps this night might change everything. But as hope flickered to life among the assembled conspirators, none of them noticed the solitary figure watching from the damaged bell tower above, whose loyalty belonged neither to crown nor council, but to a power none of them had yet recognized. The cathedral's ancient stones seemed to absorb Alara's words as she laid bare the kingdom's corrupt foundation. Her voice, strengthened by years of hidden knowledge and righteous anger, carried to the furthest shadows where skeptical nobles and merchants listened with growing horror. No longer the frightened child sold for a sack of grain, she stood before them as living testimony to a system that devoured its most vulnerable, while feeding lies to those with power to change it. "Lord Harrow," she said, addressing a gray-haired nobleman whose once prosperous lands had fallen into decline. "The drought that supposedly destroyed your southern wheat fields 4 years ago, a fabrication. Your harvest was seized by royal decree and recorded as strategic reserve acquisition. The grain was sold across the border at triple its value, with profits divided among council members." She slid a document forward, its royal seal unmistakable. "Your family's loyalty across 9 generations was repaid with calculated theft." The old lord's hands trembled as he examined the evidence, his face ashen. "My son took his own life, believing he had failed to manage our estates properly." A ripple of muttered curses spread through the gathered conspirators. Alara continued methodically, connecting individual grievances to the larger pattern of corruption. For 2 hours she presented irrefutable proof of systematic betrayal touching every person present: nobility robbed of ancestral wealth, merchants taxed into poverty despite official charters promising protection, military officers whose soldiers deserted when supplies vanished into council members' private storehouses. Finally, she turned toward the most dangerous truth. "You believe your kingdom is ruled by royal authority, with a council advising on matters of state. The reality is far different." Her eyes sought the queen's, receiving a slight nod of permission before continuing. "The royal family itself exists as hostages to the council's ambition. The king signs decrees he never reads, believing they contain policies explained to him in carefully edited summaries. The queen presides over ceremonies while her actual authority is systematically undermined. Even their son, your future king, is raised with deliberate misinformation about the realm he will someday inherit." The cathedral fell into stunned silence. To criticize corrupt advisors was dangerous but conceivable. To suggest the entire power structure operated as elaborate theater undermined the very foundation of their society. The queen stepped forward, her regal composure both confirmation and challenge. "You wonder why I would support such revelations rather than preserve comfortable lies? The answer stands before you." She gestured toward Alara. "When a child sold into slavery can recognize injustice more clearly than those born to power and privilege, the system has failed beyond redemption." Captain Draymont of the Eastern Division, a battle-scarred veteran who had lost half his command to inadequate supplies, broke the tense silence. "Fine words and damning evidence, Your Majesty. But what exactly do you propose? Rebellion has historically ended with peasants impaled on military pikes, while nobles negotiate comfortable pardons." "Not rebellion," the Queen clarified. "Restoration. The Council meets in 3 days to approve new taxation edicts. They will find instead a different assembly waiting, one comprised of those they have wronged, armed with evidence they cannot dismiss." Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the gathering. Merchant Guild Master Thorne, no relation to their captured ally, but a man whose trading caravans had been decimated by the council's corruption, voiced their collective doubt. "You suggest we simply walk into the council chamber and demand—" "What? Men who orchestrate systematic theft and murder will hardly surrender power because we present evidence of their crimes." They will when that evidence is presented before every power faction simultaneously. Aldrich interjected, his scholar's voice carrying surprising authority. The Council maintains control by ensuring no single group possesses complete understanding of their operations. Military officers believe supply shortages result from merchant guild profiteering. Merchant guilds attribute caravan losses to military incompetence. Noble houses suspect each other of secret alliances against their interests. Divided blame ensures collective powerlessness. Elara felt a surge of pride at her mentor's strategic insight. His years in the dungeon had neither broken his spirit nor dulled his intellect. The gathering transformed from skeptical audience to determined conspirators as they formulated a meticulous plan for confrontation. Maps of the castle were drawn, timetables established, specific roles assigned based on position and access. The cathedral, long abandoned by religious authority, became the staging ground for a different kind of salvation. As dawn approached, only Elara, the queen, and Aldrich remained in the cathedral's nave, their faces gray with exhaustion, but eyes bright with cautious hope. It could work, Aldrich mused, stroking his beard thoughtfully. Though much depends on timing and the council's response, cornered rats bite most viciously. The queen nodded, shadows beneath her eyes testifying to sleepless nights. Lord Cavendish controls the most loyal guards. If he suspects even a hint of our intentions, the castle will become a slaughterhouse. Elara, who had been studying the cathedral's stone floor in thought, looked up suddenly. Then we must ensure he has no warning and no escape route when confronted. Her mind raced through possibilities, applying Aldrich's teachings to this ultimate challenge. We need someone inside his personal household, someone he trusts implicitly. A troubled expression crossed the queen's face. Cavendish trusts no one. His personal servants are replaced monthly to prevent any developing loyalties. Even his guards. Not his household staff, Elara interrupted, an idea taking shape. His conscience. Understanding dawned in Aldrich's eyes. Father Bennett, the royal confessor. Who hears the sins of every council member? The queen whispered, realization spreading across her features. Who knows their darkest secrets and administers meaningless penances while they continue their corruption? Elara nodded. And who has access to every private chamber on the pretext of spiritual guidance? The only man permitted to move freely throughout the castle without guards or witnesses. The gambit carried enormous risk. Approaching the royal confessor could destroy everything if his loyalty lay with the council rather than with true spiritual authority. Yet his position provided the perfect cover for gathering final intelligence and ensuring Cavendish remained unaware until the moment of confrontation. I'll speak with him, the queen decided, her voice carrying the weight of command that years of ceremonial duties had not completely erased. There are sins I've never confessed that might interest a true servant of faith. As she departed through a side entrance, Elara and Aldrich remained in the cathedral's growing morning light. The old scholar studied his former student with undisguised pride. When I began teaching you letters through that dungeon wall, I never imagined this outcome, he admitted. I thought perhaps to give you tools for personal survival, not kingdom salvation. Elara's gaze drifted upward to the damaged spire, where morning light streamed through broken rafters. I still don't know if survival is possible for any of us. The council has ruled through fear and manipulation for generations. Such power rarely surrenders without bloodshed. True, Aldrich conceded, yet consider this. They have made one critical error that may prove fatal to their authority. His weathered hand gently touched her shoulder. They created you, the perfect weapon against their corruption. A child with nothing left to lose, whose mind absorbed knowledge they believed safely contained, whose spirit remained unbroken by the very systems designed to crush it. His words warmed something long cold within her chest. For the first time since childhood, Elara allowed herself to imagine a future beyond survival and resistance, perhaps even one where she might find some measure of peace. The possibility felt almost more frightening than certain death. Their moment of reflection shattered at the cathedral's main entrance burst open. Fergus the blacksmith stumbled in, blood streaming from a gash across his forehead, his massive frame supporting a half-conscious thorn. Ambush! Fergus gasped, lowering their wounded ally to the stone floor. Cavendish's personal guard intercepted us at the eastern gate. Someone betrayed our meeting. Alara rushed forward, her heart seizing at the sight of Thorn's gray face and the alarming spread of crimson across his tunic. His eyes, clouded with pain, found hers. "They know," he whispered, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth with each labored breath. "Everything. The treasury documents. The cathedral meeting." His fingers clutched desperately at her arm. "The Queen." Understanding struck with horrible clarity. Alara's gaze shot to the side entrance where the Queen had departed minutes earlier. "It's a trap. All of it." She turned to Aldrich, whose expression reflected her own dawning horror. "We need to warn the others, now." But even as they moved toward the cathedral doors, the unmistakable sound of marching footsteps surrounded the ancient building. Through the damaged walls, they glimpsed armored guards taking position at every possible exit. "Too late," Fergus muttered, drawing a concealed blade from his boot. "Seems we'll meet our fate here after all." As if confirming his words, the main doors swung open again. Instead of the expected guards, however, a single figure entered. The royal confessor himself, Father Bennett, his expression unreadable beneath his hood. "The Queen sends her regrets," he announced, voice echoing through the cathedral's vaulted ceiling. "She will be unable to attend your execution." The ancient cathedral, once a sanctuary of faith, now became an arena for the final confrontation. Alara felt time slow as her mind calculated their impossible situation. Armed guards surrounding every exit, Thorn bleeding on the stone floor, and before them stood Father Bennett, the royal confessor whose loyalties had clearly been misplaced. She had escaped chains twice before, but this trap seemed perfectly designed to be her last. "Your execution," Father Bennett repeated, his voice carrying through the cavernous space, "has been scheduled rather hastily by Lord Cavendish. The Queen, however, sends something more valuable than her presence." His weathered hands emerged from voluminous sleeves, offering a sealed parchment bearing the royal insignia. Suspicion froze Alara in place. Another deception? Another trap within a trap? The confessor's face remained impassive as stone. "The Queen's betrayal is both real and not what you imagine. Take this, quickly. Guards will breach these doors within minutes." Fergus stepped forward protectively, his blacksmith's frame towering over the elderly priest. "Give us one reason to trust anything connected to the crown after this treachery." "Because," Father Bennett said quietly, "I have heard the confessions of every council member for 2 decades. Their sins would turn these sacred stones black with corruption. Yet I remained silent, bound by holy oaths, my greatest failure." His eyes, rheumy with age but sharp with purpose, fixed on Alara, until a kitchen slave showed more courage than a man of God. Something in his gaze, remorse tangled with resolve, convinced her to accept the sealed document. The parchment felt unnaturally heavy in her hands as she broke the royal seal. Inside was not a letter, but a map unlike any she had studied in their planning sessions, a detailed rendering of passages beneath the castle, many unknown even to their most informed allies. "The Queen's betrayal was staged to protect the young prince," Father Bennett explained, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Cavendish holds the boy as insurance against any royal defiance. She feeds them false information while working to secure her son's safety." Aldrich leaned heavily on his walking staff, his scholar's mind visibly reassessing everything they had believed true. The treasury documents, the cathedral meeting. The documents were genuine, her gift to your cause. The meeting was indeed betrayed, but not by her. The priest's expression darkened. "There is another player in this game of power, one whose identity remains hidden even from me." A crash against the cathedral's main doors punctuated his warning. Wood splintered as royal guards began their assault on the ancient barrier. "These passages," Father Bennett continued urgently, pointing to the map, "will lead you beneath the castle to the council chamber itself. The Queen has arranged a diversion that will occupy most of the guards at precisely noon. The council members will be gathered but vulnerable." Fergus hefted his blade skeptically. "And we're to believe the same woman who led us into this trap has arranged our salvation?" "Believe what you wish," the priest replied with surprising steel in his voice. "But understand this, The kingdom stands at a precipice. Today will either begin its healing or cement its destruction for generations. He turned toward a weathered statue of a saint, pressing hidden mechanisms that revealed a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Choose now. Death here, or a final chance at justice. Another crash against the doors made their decision urgent. Fergus lifted Thorne's semi-conscious form over his shoulder, while Aldrich gathered their critical documents. Ilara hesitated, studying Father Bennett's face for any sign of deception. "Why help us now, after years of silent complicity?" she demanded. A bitter smile crossed the old priest's features. "Because salvation requires more than whispered prayers and empty rituals. Sometimes it demands action from the most unlikely vessels." He pressed a small object into her palm, a key crafted from dark metal, its design ancient and strange. "The council chamber has one entrance that even Lord Cavendish has forgotten, sealed generations ago when kings still feared divine judgment might reach them even there." The doors began to give way as Ilara made her decision, following her companions down the narrow stairs. Father Bennett remained behind, moving with surprising dignity toward the breaking entrance. "What will happen to him?" Aldrich whispered as they descended into darkness. "A confessor faces those he has failed," Ilara replied, her voice tight with emotions she could not afford to examine. "As we all must eventually." The passages beneath the castle proved exactly as the map indicated. Ancient, forgotten channels carved through bedrock centuries before the current power structure existed. They navigated by torchlight through the suffocating darkness, Fergus struggling under Thorne's weight while Aldrich's wheezing breath betrayed the toll of their desperate flight. Thorne regained consciousness briefly, his eyes focusing on Ilara with feverish intensity. "If we reach the council chamber," he gasped, "what then? We're hardly an army." "We don't need an army," she replied, studying the map by flickering light. "We need witnesses and truth." His blood-flecked lips curved into a weak smile. Always the optimist. "Not optimism," Aldrich corrected, his scholar's precision undimmed by their dire circumstances. "Strategy. The council's power depends on secrecy and division. Exposed before representatives from every faction simultaneously, their authority becomes vulnerable in ways physical weapons cannot touch." They reached a junction where 5 tunnels converged, marked on the map with a warning: "Guardians sleep here." The chamber they entered contained stone sarcophagi, their lids carved with figures of knights in eternal repose, the final resting place of the kingdom's founders, forgotten beneath the castle they had built. "We must disturb their rest," Ilara murmured apologetically, approaching the central tomb. According to the map, it concealed the passage they sought, the forgotten entrance to the council chamber. As noon approached, they positioned themselves beneath what the map indicated was the chamber floor itself. Muffled voices filtered down, council members assembling for what they believed would be a routine approval of new taxation edicts. Ilara recognized Lord Cavendish's imperious tone issuing instructions, followed by obsequious agreements from lesser members. "The taxation increases must be implemented immediately," Cavendish was saying. "The eastern villages have shown troubling signs of resistance. An example must be made." Another voice, smooth as oil but carrying hidden barbs, responded, "Perhaps we should consider the Queen's concerns about pushing the peasantry too far. Starving subjects cannot pay taxes." "The Queen's concerns are irrelevant," Cavendish dismissed. "She has finally been shown her proper place in our governance. The recent rebel activity has proven most useful in that regard." Ilara's eyes met Aldrich's in silent communication. The timing had to be precise. According to Father Bennett's information, the Queen's diversion would begin momentarily, drawing guards from the council chamber to deal with a staged emergency elsewhere in the castle. As if summoned by their thoughts, a distant explosion shook the stone around them. Dust filtered down from the ceiling as shouts erupted above. "The armory!" someone cried. "We're under attack." Cavendish's voice cut through the panic with practiced authority. "Remain calm. Guards, investigate immediately. The rest of you, stay here where it's secure." Footsteps thundered overhead as most of the chamber's guards departed, leaving the council temporarily vulnerable. Ilara inserted the ancient key into a mechanism that had not been used in generations, praying that time had not rendered it useless. For one terrible moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of protesting stone, a section of the council chamber floor began to recede, revealing their position below. Light flooded the passage as astonished faces peered down at the unexpected intruders. Ilara emerged first, her simple servant's dress now stained with dirt and blood, her eyes burning with the accumulated rage of years of injustice. Behind her came Aldrich, then Fergus, supporting the wounded Thorn. "What is the meaning of this?" Lord Cavendish demanded, his hand moving to the ceremonial sword at his belt, ornate but nonetheless deadly. "Justice," Ilara replied, her voice steady despite the thundering of her heart. Long delayed but finally delivered. She recognized other faces around the table, council members whose signatures she had memorized from countless corrupt decrees, whose casual decisions had condemned villages to starvation. Their expressions ranged from shock to fury to the beginning glimmers of fear. "Arrest these traitors immediately!" Cavendish commanded, but the few remaining guards hesitated, uncertain in the face of this unprecedented breach and the distant sounds of chaos elsewhere in the castle. "Before you decide where your loyalty lies," Ilara addressed the guards directly, "you should know exactly whom you serve." She spread the damning treasury documents across the council table, their official seals gleaming in the chamber's light. "These are the true records of how your pay has been diverted, how supplies meant for your fellow soldiers have been sold for private profit, how families of fallen guards have been denied their rightful compensation." Uncertainty flickered across the guards' faces as Aldrich stepped forward, his scholarly authority lending weight to each revelation. "The council has not served the kingdom but bled it dry, using the crown as puppet and shield for their corruption." Lord Cavendish's face contorted with rage. "These are the desperate lies of condemned criminals. Guards, do your duty." The chamber doors burst open, but instead of reinforcements, the Queen herself entered, flanked by military officers and guild representatives who had attended the cathedral meeting. Behind them came Father Bennett, bloodied but unbowed, and most shocking of all, the king himself, his expression a storm of betrayal and dawning comprehension. "My duty," the captain of the Royal Guard said slowly, stepping away from Cavendish, "has always been to the crown and kingdom, not to thieves who wear official robes." The council chamber erupted into chaos as accusations flew, and decades of carefully constructed deception began crumbling under the weight of exposed truth. Through it all, Ilara stood unwavering, the former kitchen slave whose understanding of power's true machinery had brought them to this unprecedented moment. When the shouting finally subsided, all eyes turned to the king, whose authority, however compromised it had been, remained the kingdom's ultimate legal foundation. "I have been a fool," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "A crown means nothing if the head beneath it is kept ignorant." His gaze swept the chamber, settling finally on Ilara with an expression of wonder and respect that no slave had ever received from royalty. "Your courage has given this kingdom its only chance at redemption." In that moment, as nobles and criminals alike awaited royal judgment, Ilara felt the weight of chains she had carried since childhood, real and metaphorical, finally begin to lift. From chains that bound her wrists to a crown that changed a kingdom, Ilara's journey reminds us that true power lies not in titles or treasures, but in the courage to stand for truth when silence would be safer. Her transformation from a child sold for grain to a leader who reformed a corrupt system challenges us to examine our own lives. Where do we remain silent in the face of injustice? What chains, visible or invisible, do we accept as inevitable rather than challenging? Perhaps the most profound lesson in this medieval tale is that change rarely comes from those comfortable within the system. It emerges from those who have suffered its failures and can envision something better. If you found yourself in Ilara's position, with nothing left to lose and truth as your only weapon, would you have the courage to use it? Or would you seek safety in shadows and survival alone? If this story touched your heart or sparked reflection, please consider sharing it with someone who needs its message today. Every great change begins with a single voice that refuses to be silenced. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that illuminate the darkest corners of human experience and celebrate the resilience of the human spirit. Remember, History is filled with unlikely heroes. Perhaps you might be the next.